Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. Today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the floor press, which I've been using as a regular primary exercise. A lot of guys are going to be like, you know what, you're just a fat power lifter. I'd say, you know what, floor press is making me fat in the only place where it counts, damn titties. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. So the question would become, why would someone use the floor press? Why not just bench? There can be a number of reasons why. Real high on the list, I'm doing a lot of training in commercial gyms lately. Now, they're very well equipped commercial gyms that I've been at because they've got a lot of functional strength training stuff, a lot of racks. They're a little shy on good benches. In fact, I don't have access to a single adjustable bench. At the usual 2 gyms that I train at the most, I don't have access to a decent bench. There's no way to adjust J-hooks, which again becomes a problem. If you're going to power bench, that's a problem. So it means I've got to rely on spotters, and the issue is, like I've shown you guys in the past, you can get out from under a bench without a spotter just fine. The problem is that I would be stuck in a crowded area of the gym. I'm very likely to injure someone if I get pinned. I'm doing a lot of max effort training right now. My chances of missing a rep, probably, 10% in any given workout. I'm going to end up throwing 300 plus pounds on somebody who's not paying attention, who's at my feet when I put the bar down. Less crowded gym, it's not a big deal. That's kind of the things that I taught. One of the workarounds is when you're in a gym and it's not crowded and no one there qualified to spot you. And also in that case, I'm doing power training, max effort work. It's very, very difficult to get gym bros to spot you correctly on a bench press. You have to train a new one each time. And you got to find a guy big enough to row the weight off you. You've got to train them that they don't touch the bar till you get pinned, because again, guys do that 2-finger stuff. That sort of stuff is nonsense. It's almost the worst thing anyone could do, and it's this weird gym bro culture thing of all you and they're putting 2 fingers under. You don't want help. If you're grinding a rep like that, the very last thing you want is another person to touch it. The very last thing you want is them to touch it. You're losing all that adaptative stress of that hard rep that you're doing. It went to waste if they touch it. You're trying to get strong enough to actually lift that weight. Well, they just removed the load. You lost some of the training adaptation. And now you can't program. They mess with your whole programming. It's a really bad habit. And so there's the problems you run into. And then they don't get over the bar because they're doing that 2-finger thing. What are they going to do if you actually do get pinned? They need to be ready to grab the bar, in a mixed grip and deadlift it off of you is what they need to be ready to do. And also, same problem. I'm back up over benching 300 now. This is going to be a problem for me dealing in commercial gyms. It's different when you've got big guys there. Not always a case of that. So, for me, relying on spotters, lack of access to good equipment, means the floor press becomes a viable option. Now, the good points of the floor press, I'm doing Bulgarian training. I'm pressing at a very, very high frequency. I press 5 to 6 days a week of some type. At least 2 of those are the floor press. At least 3 of those are going to be my strict standing press. The floor press is easier on your rotator cuffs. It is safer. In fact, it was always noted years ago, back in the day when everyone floor pressed and overhead pressed, where the overhead press was a lift that everyone did, and before benches were invented, everyone floor presses, shoulder injuries were unheard of. I want people to let that sink in. When overhead pressing was the norm and floor pressing existed before the flat bench, rotator cuff injuries were almost non-existent. They were unheard of. This is a modern phenomenon due to everyone benching on benches with dumbbells and barbells and everything who don't know what they're doing. And it's easier to mess these up. It's easier to get hurt. It's easier to use bad techniques that will injure you. It's a lot easier. Harder to do with a floor press. And you have a terminal range of motion that stops it. And it can stop you from overextending to a certain point also. So there's a lot of injury prevention things going on there. But the other thing to consider there is mainly it's easier on your shoulder joints. But it has good transfer over the bench press. Essentially, if you're big enough to where you get full range of motion, there are no real negatives other than the loss of floor drive. Now, in my case, I'm obviously thick enough, guys, that I can touch my chest on the bench press. If I do a little bit of an arch while on the floor, I can make contact with my chest. at the bottom. So for me, it is a full range of motion exercise. So all you're doing is removing a leg drive. You're making it harder. You're forcing yourself to get more explosive off of the bottom so that when you can bench again, if you're using this in place of a bench or as an accessory exercise, because you may not treat it as a primary exercise, but it was a primary exercise back in the day. But it forces you to use a little less weight. So it can be, again, easier on things like wrists and everything, even for high volumes of heavy work. But the fact is, it forces you to be explosive without leg drive added in. And so when you are able to add leg drive back in, it becomes a big deal. Now, a lot of people would say, yeah, but realistically, if you just use leg drive and pause bench year round, why would it matter? You're going to get explosive anyways. And that is a good point, and that is something to consider unless you have other reasons to work the floor press in. Now, in my case, because of where I'm training, I might use it all the way until I build a home gym again. Then I can go back to flat benching because I can have adjustable racks, set everything how I want it. But the thing is, it can still build the strength up. The floor press tends to give direct carryover to your pause bench. It tends to give direct carryover as long as you maintain shoulder mobility, meaning you've either got to be thick enough, you have to be thick enough to touch your chest, and if you're not, things like weighted dips can train that shoulder mobility. Weighted dips, dumbbells, but I was leaning in the direction of weighted dips. So in that case, if a person wants to use the floor press, those are the two things to consider. And even if you are thick enough, still working in some weighted dips isn't a bad idea. But yeah, like in my case, because of my total training situation I'm in, the environment I'm in with training, access to certain equipment, for me right now, the floor press is just easier to do. It's easier to set up. Since I'm already squatting every day, I'm already pulling every day, I already am in a platform and a power rack already, and I always squat first, it's not a big deal for me to just stay in the same station I'm in, set up a floor press, and do a floor press, and then row or whatever afterwards. So in my particular case, it's just really convenient to floor press. And for a lot of you, it might be. But the things to consider here are going to be if you've got a history of shoulder injuries and you are having problems with the flat bench, floor press is just easier on your shoulder joints overall. It is much harder to damage a rotator cuff doing it. And so, again, it can become a viable option for you. If you're in an environment where you have access to plenty of racks, but maybe not an adjustable bench, now, some people be like, why can't you just drag a bench over to the rack? Because their benches are all bolted to the floors. So it's not an option for me there either. So if you're in a situation where you don't trust your spotters, you're in an environment where you can't just throw it on the floor like I taught in another video, maybe you've got shoulder injuries, maybe you've got a lot of other things going on, the floor press can become very, very attractive as a primary exercise until the environment you're in changes. And even if you decide you're going to power lift later, you can always change your environment up to peak for meet. The strength that you build on a floor press will carry over. And mine's coming along pretty good. For those curious, I hit a 315 close grip floor press today. Obviously, because again, it's full range of motion for me, I can bench more than I can floor press. And even for people who it tends to be a partial, because they're not thick enough to touch their chest, most people can still flat bench more than they floor press, even if it's a partial. And again, it has to do with the inability to use a leg drive because it takes the leg drive out and it forces you to come to a dead stop. There is no way to touch and go it without hurting yourself. If you start doing touch and go, you will tend to hurt your elbows when they hit the floor. You'll tend to bruise your triceps up. It forces you, if you want to train safely, to come to a dead stop. So it trains you to build a lot of explosiveness on the bench press and to get really, really strong out of the bottom, which is what you want. And that's funny because you'll see people online who will say things like, well, the floor press is a mid-range exercise. Yeah, if you're dealing with 150-pound kids, but if you're big enough to touch your chest, it's actually a bottom range of motion exercise. So again, for the raw bencher, it actually has merits for guys who have put on a little bit of size. For novice lifters, not so much. But if I was a novice lifter who didn't have access to the right environment to bench press, I'd still consider using the floor press as a primary exercise, so much so that most novice programs, if it's what you have available to you, you can substitute it in and it'll be just fine. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.